The sound didn't just wake them. It shook the very foundation of the house in East Elmhurst. It was 2:46 a.m. on a freezing February night. Inside, a pregnant woman scrambled in the dark, shielding her 4 terrified daughters as flames began to lick at the curtains. This was not an accident. A Molotov cocktail had shattered the front window, turning a family home into a burning cage. Standing amidst the smoke and the screaming sirens was a man who had once been the most feared voice in America. But that night, he wasn't a leader commanding a podium. He was a father watching his sanctuary burn. He looked at the charred remains of a nursery, and he knew the truth that the police reports would not say. The people who threw that firebomb weren't strangers. They were the men he used to call brothers. He had spent years building a movement on loyalty, but now he was learning the brutal price of leaving it behind. When the people you worship decide you are an enemy, where do you run? This is the story of the final, desperate year of Malcolm X. Not as a legend, but as a man hunted by his own past. Before the suits, before the speeches, and before the world knew him as Malcolm X, there was a boy named Malcolm Little, trembling in the American heartland. His story didn't begin with power, it began with terror. Born in Omaha, Nebraska, in 1925, Malcolm was introduced to the brutality of racism before he could even read. His father, Earl Little, was a preacher, a big, defiant man who dared to speak out for black pride. But in those days, pride was a dangerous thing for a black man to have. The Ku Klux Klan didn't just send threats. They rode in the night, shattering windows and terrorizing the family. The violence followed them. When a family moved to Lansing, Michigan, hoping for peace, they found only fire. In 1929, their home was burned to the ground. Malcolm stood there, a 4-year-old child, watching the flames consume everything they owned while the white firefighters stood by, refusing to pump a drop of water. It was a lesson he would never unlearn. In America, safety was a privilege, not a right. But the true darkness came 2 years later. His father's body was found nearly severed in 2 across trolley tracks. The authorities called it a suicide, a cruel lie that denied the family their insurance money. Malcolm watched his mother, Louise, fight a losing battle against poverty and a system designed to break her. Slowly, the stress fractured her mind. The state stepped in, not to help, but to dismantle. They declared her insane, institutionalized her, and split the children apart. By the time he was a teenager, Malcolm Little had lost his father to violence, his mother to the asylum, and his siblings to the foster system. He was alone, without a compass. Malcolm drifted east, landing in the neon-lit streets of Boston and later, Harlem. Here, the frightened boy from Michigan died, and Detroit Red was born. This was the era of the Zoot suit and the Lindy Hop. Malcolm reinvented himself. He straightened his hair with lye that burned his scalp, a painful ritual to look more like the white man he was taught to emulate. He immersed himself in the underworld. He wasn't a leader then. He was a hustler. He ran numbers, peddled drugs, and orchestrated burglaries. He carried a pistol and a restlessness that no amount of money could cure. He was living fast, dancing on the edge of a razor, trying to numb the pain of his shattered childhood with the adrenaline of the street. But the streets always collect their debt. In 1946, just before his 21st birthday, the law caught up with him. He was arrested for a string of burglaries in Boston. The judge didn't just see a thief. He saw a black man who had been involved with white women. The sentence was harsh, 10 years in state prison. Charlestown State Prison was a tomb for the living. In that cramped, cold cell, Detroit Red hit rock bottom. He was angry, bitter, and godless, earning the nickname Satan from his fellow inmates for his foul mouth and hatred of religion. But it was in this cage that he found his freedom. His brother Reginald came to visit him with a message that sounded like madness. He spoke of a man named Elijah Muhammad, a mysterious leader of a group called the Nation of Islam. He told Malcolm that the white man was the devil and that God was black. For the first time, Malcolm heard a narrative that didn't paint him as a victim or a savage, but as royalty who had been stolen. Malcolm stopped hustling and started studying. He copied the entire dictionary, page by page, just to learn the words he needed to express the fire inside him. He read history philosophy, and religion under the dim prison light, ruining his eyes but sharpening his mind. He began writing letters to Elijah Muhammad, pouring out his guilt and his hope. The teachings of the Nation of Islam gave him something the streets never could: discipline and dignity. He stopped smoking. He stopped eating pork. He stopped cursing. He washed the conch out of his hair and let it grow natural. He realized that little was the name of the slave master who had owned his ancestors. He rejected it. In its place, he took the letter X, symbolizing the true African family name that history had erased. When he walked out of prison in 1952, the criminal Detroit Red was dead. Malcolm X stepped into the sunlight, tall, fierce, and armed with a truth that would shake America to its core. He had found a father figure in Elijah Muhammad, and he was ready to serve the Nation of Islam with a loyalty so fierce it bordered on worship. He didn't know it then, but this absolute devotion would become the source of his greatest triumph, and his ultimate tragedy. That be why the late 1950s, Malcolm X was no longer just a man. He was a phenomenon. If Martin Luther King Jr. was the dream of America, Malcolm X was its wake-up call. He didn't march for integration. He preached separation. He didn't ask for a seat at the counter. He demanded to own the restaurant. He hit the streets of Harlem like a storm. Standing on soapboxes on 125th Street, his voice cut through the noise of the city. He possessed a charisma that was electric, a mix of street-smart wit and scholarly precision. He pointed a long, accusing finger at white America and said what millions of black people were terrified to even whisper in the privacy of their own homes. "We didn't land on Plymouth Rock," he thundered, his eyes flashing behind browline glasses. "Plymouth Rock landed on us." Under his tireless leadership, the Nation of Islam transformed from a fringe group of 400 members into a militant empire of 40,000. He was everywhere, debating Ivy League professors, appearing on television talk shows, and founding the newspaper Muhammad Speaks. He was the dutiful soldier, always deflecting credit to his teacher. Every speech began and ended with the name, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He was the perfect son, but in the shadows of success, envy began to fester. While Malcolm X was living on a modest salary, driving a simple car, and working 18-hour days for the cause, he began to hear whispers. The leadership in Chicago, the inner circle around Elijah Muhammad, grew jealous of the red-headed giant who was capturing all the headlines. They whispered that Malcolm was becoming bigger than the movement, bigger than the messenger himself. Then came a heartbreak that shattered his faith. Malcolm began to receive reports that Elijah Muhammad, the man he revered as a moral prophet, was fathering children with his young secretaries. At first, Malcolm refused to believe it. He was the sword of the Nation of Islam, ready to strike down any liar. But the evidence became undeniable. He spoke to the women. He saw the children. The pedestal he had built for his spiritual father crumbled. The betrayal cut deep, not just politically, but personally. He had given his life to a lie. The tension finally snapped in November 1963. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The nation was in mourning, and Elijah Muhammad issued a strict order: no comments on the tragedy. But when a reporter shoved a microphone in Malcolm's face and asked for his reaction, the honesty that defined him slipped out. He called the assassination a case of chickens coming home to roost, implying that the violence America exported around the world had finally returned to its own doorstep. It was a harsh truth, spoken too soon. The media crucified him, but the Nation of Islam saw an opportunity. They didn't defend him, they silenced him. Elijah Muhammad suspended Malcolm for 90 days. It was meant to be a punishment, a humiliation, but Malcolm realized it was actually an eviction. They didn't want him silent. They wanted him gone. In March 1964, standing alone and vulnerable, Malcolm X announced his break from the Nation of Islam. It was the most dangerous decision of his life. He was stripping away his protection. He was now a man without a country, caught between the government that watched him and the former brothers who now hated him. Seeking clarity, he did something radical. He got on a plane to Mecca. The Hajj pilgrimage in April 1964 changed everything. Malcolm X left America as a black separatist He returned as a global human rights activist. In the holy city, he saw something that defied the teachings of the Nation of Islam. He saw Muslims of all colors, from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africans, eating from the same plate, praying shoulder to shoulder, treating each other as equals. He wrote a letter home that stunned the world. I have eaten from the same plate and drank from the same glass with fellow Muslims whose eyes were the bluest of blue, whose hair was the blondest of blonde, and whose skin was the whitest of white. The anger was still there, but the hate was gone. He took a new name, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. He returned to the United States with a broader vision. He wasn't just fighting for civil rights, which was a domestic issue. He was fighting for human rights, a cause that could be brought before the United Nations. This evolution made him more powerful than ever, but also made him a target. To the Nation of Islam, he was now a hypocrite and a traitor who had abandoned their racial theology. To the FBI, he was a dangerous internationalist connecting the American struggle with African revolutions. He was no longer just a troublemaker. He was a threat to the established order on all sides. As 1964 drew to a close, the shadows lengthened. The phone calls started coming in the middle of the night. The death threats weren't whispered anymore. They were printed in cartoons in the very newspaper he had helped found. The clock was ticking, and Malcolm X could hear every second. Why January 1965. The air around Malcolm X was so thick with tension you could almost taste the metal of a gun barrel. He wasn't just paranoid. He was precise. He told his close friends, "I'm a dead man already." He knew the machinery of death had been activated, and he knew exactly who was operating the gears. The Nation of Islam had declared war. It wasn't subtle. In the pages of Muhammad Speaks, the newspaper he had once sold on street corners, Louis X, now Louis Farrakhan, wrote chilling words that left no room for interpretation. Such a man as Malcolm is worthy of death. It was a public execution order printed in black and white. Betrayal had turned into bloodlust. The brothers who had once stood guard for him were now the ones studying his schedule, looking for an opening. But they weren't the only ones watching. Malcolm X was living under a microscope. The FBI surveillance on him was total. Agents were parked outside his home. Wiretaps recorded his most private conversations. Everywhere he went, from the airports in Africa to the streets of Queens, he was followed. And here lies the darkest irony. The FBI knew about the death threats. They had informants deep inside the Nation of Islam. They knew a hit was coming, yet they did nothing to stop it. In fact, as the danger escalated, the police protection around Malcolm mysteriously vanished. He was left exposed, a lone target in an open field, caught between the vengeance of a cult and the indifference of the state. Then came a morning of February 21st, 1965. It was a Sunday afternoon at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. The mood was strange. Malcolm was exhausted, his nerves frayed from the firebombing just a week earlier. He had told his security team not to search people at the door, a fatal lapse in judgment, born perhaps from fatigue or a desire to show he wasn't afraid of his own people. Inside the ballroom, 400 people waited. In the front row, his pregnant wife, Betty, sat with their 4 young daughters. They were there to see their father work, to see the man the world feared, just being a dad and a leader. At roughly 3:10 p.m., Malcolm X walked onto the stage. He looked out at the crowd, a small smile touching his tired face. "Assalamu alaikum," he greeted them. "Wa alaikum assalam." The crowd responded. "Peace." It was the last word he would ever hear. Suddenly, a commotion broke out in the middle of the room. "Get your hand out of my pocket," a man yelled. It was a decoy, a staged fight to draw the eyes of the bodyguards away from the stage. As the security moved toward the noise, the Real assassins stood up in the front row. A man with a sawed-off shotgun lunged forward. A blast thundered through the hall, tearing into Malcolm's chest. The force knocked him backward over a chair. 2 other men charged the stage, firing semi-automatic handguns into his fallen body. It wasn't just an assassination, it was an overkill. 15 bullets. Chaos erupted. Screams filled the air. But amidst the stampede, one sound pierced through the horror, the voice of Betty Shabazz. She didn't run away. She threw her body over her children, shielding them from the bullets, screaming, They are killing my husband. They are killing him." On the stage, the man who had ignited a revolution lay silent. His shirt was soaked in blood, his glasses shattered on the floor. The police arrived slowly, almost casually. The FBI surveillance logs would later note the time of death, closing the file on the man they had watched for years but refused to save. The black shining prince was gone. The Nation of Islam had silenced its critic. The government had lost its troublemaker. But as the smoke cleared in the Audubon Ballroom, the world began to realize that killing the man would not kill the truth he spoke. When the smoke cleared inside the Audubon Ballroom, the narrative machine began to spin faster than the wheels of justice. The morning after the assassination, the American media didn't mourn the loss of a human rights leader. They shrugged. The headlines were cold and dismissive. The New York Times described Malcolm X as a twisted man who had turned many true gifts to evil purpose. The general sentiment in white America was one of relief, painted with a stroke of victim blaming. He preached violence, so he died by violence. It was a convenient story. It reduced a political execution to a simple gang war between rival black factions. It told the public, "Look away, there is nothing to see here but criminals killing criminals." But the world saw something different. While America tried to bury his memory, the international community wept. In Africa, where Malcolm X was hailed as a returning prince, flags flew at half-staff. Leaders in Ghana, Egypt, and Tanzania condemned the killing as a blow to the global struggle against imperialism. They didn't see a thug. They saw a diplomat who had dared to bring the plight of Black America to the United Nations. The contrast was stark. He was a pariah at home, but a prophet abroad. Back in New York, the investigation that followed was a masterclass in negligence. The police arrested 3 men, Talmadge Hayer, Muhammad A., Aziz, and Khalil Islam. Hayer was caught at the scene. He had been shot in the leg by a bodyguard. He confessed. But here is where the story gets dark. Hayer stood in court and testified under oath that the other 2 men, Aziz and Islam, were innocent. He said they weren't even there. The system didn't care. Prosecutors needed bodies to fill the cells, and the narrative needed closure. Despite the lack of physical evidence, despite Hayer's confession clearing them, and despite solid alibis, Aziz and Islam were convicted. They were sent to prison for decades for a crime they did not commit. It was a second betrayal, first by the assassins, then by the law. For 50 years, the truth lay buried under redacted files. But history has a way of leaking out. Decades later, when the FBI surveillance files were finally declassified, the depth of the government's involvement became terrifyingly clear. We learned that the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover had sent a directive to his agents to do something about Malcolm X. We learned that on the day of the murder, the usual heavy police presence had been strangely pulled back, leaving the ballroom wide open. Even more chilling was the revelation about the man who gave Malcolm X mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on the stage. He wasn't just a concerned bystander. He was an undercover NYPD agent named Gene Roberts, who had infiltrated Malcolm's security team. The authorities were so close, they were literally breathing into his dying lungs. Yet they claimed they had no intelligence to stop the hit. It wasn't until 2021, more than half a century too late, that the state of New York finally admitted the truth. The Manhattan District Attorney exonerated Muhammad A., Aziz, and Khalil Islam, apologizing for a serious miscarriage of justice. The investigation revealed that the FBI and the NYPD had withheld key evidence that would have cleared these men back in 1965. This admission changed the history books. It confirmed what conspiracy theorists had whispered for years. The assassination of Malcolm X wasn't just about angry rivals in a ballroom. It was a failure of the justice system so profound that it took 56 years to fix. The FBI surveillance wasn't there to protect him. It was there to document his demise. The tragedy wasn't just that he died, but that the truth was imprisoned along with the innocent, leaving the real architects of his death to fade into the shadows, unpunished. They buried his body in Ferncliff Cemetery, but they could not bury the fire he lit in the minds of millions. Malcolm X left us more than just speeches. He left us a blueprint for transformation. His life was a testament to the power of the human spirit to rewrite its own story. He went from a hoodlum in the streets to a minister in the temple, and finally, to a martyr on the world stage. His greatest legacy wasn't his anger, it was his courage to change. In a world that rewards consistency, he dared to admit when he was wrong. He stepped away from the betrayal of false doctrines to embrace the universal brotherhood of man, even when he knew it would cost him his life. He showed us that you don't need permission to be free, and you don't need to apologize for demanding your dignity. Today, the Audubon Ballroom has been renovated, but the echoes of that Sunday afternoon still linger. We remember him not as a saint, but as a man who loved his people enough to tell them the hard truths they didn't want to hear. He taught us that if you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything. Some stories end without closure, but dignity doesn't need applause. Malcolm X died standing up so that we wouldn't have to live on our knees. To anyone who has ever stood alone because it was the right thing to do, we see you. If this story moved you, or if it reminded you of the high price of truth, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Who is a figure in history that inspires you to be brave? Let's keep his memory alive, not just in history books, but in our conversations. Subscribe for more stories that uncover the hidden chapters of our past.